So just a quick thing, I think, for Professor Ram Guha and Professor Madhusudan. I don't think Ram Guha needs much of an introduction, but I will just do a very quick one. He is trained in economics and then sociology, and wrote one of the earliest, very influential PhD thesis in India on the history of the Chipko movement, which, of course, is one of the very major movements that have shaped Indian interest in environment and ecology even today. And so after that, he went on to write with Professor Madhav Gadgil, a very influential, again, set of two books, This Fissured Land and Ecology and Equity. Some of you might have read these. I see a lot of heads nodding. And these two books really founded the work on environmental history in India. So they were very fundamental in shaping a larger consciousness and larger interest in the area of environmental history. Of course, many of you will know Ram for his cricket books. Many of you will also know Ram very well for his books on Gandhi. But for those of us who are ecologists, we've always been curious to know when he's going to come back to environmental history. And so we were very pleased to see the book Speaking with Nature that has very recently come out. And also wonderful interlocutor in Madhusudan. MD Madhusudan is again one of India's very well-known ecologists and conservationists, and many of you would also already know him perhaps. He was a founder trustee of Nature Conservation Foundation and now is an independent researcher, and has a very interesting background in terms of working on social ecological interrelationships between humans and wildlife, which are largely in South India, but also in many other parts of India. But also a lot of work on big data, remote sensing, GIS, and forest cover change. And so the combination of these two very data oriented and very people oriented perspectives, again, is very fascinating. So I'm sure you don't want to hear me introduce them anymore. You'd like to hear Ram and Madhu talk about the book. So maybe Ram, you could give us a quick thing of the book, and Madhu.
Thank you, Harini. Thank you all for coming here, and thank you particularly to Madhu for agreeing to do this. So I thought I'll speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, give a background as to why I wrote this book, Speaking with Nature, and then I really look forward to the conversation with Madhu after that. So, as Harini mentioned, my PhD work was on the Chipko movement. And shortly after I finished my PhD, a year and a half after I finished my PhD, I went to America as a lecturer. I spent about 18 months there. And I was teaching in an environmental studies program. And my American students acquainted me with the history of the American environmental movement. Now, last year, year before last, 2023, marked the 50th anniversary of the Chipko movement. And Chipko is regarded as the foundational event of Indian environmentalism, where it began. In America, the foundational event comparable in status to Chipko is the publication of Rachel Carson's magnificent book, Silent Spring, which was published in 1962. Now, how many here have read Silent Spring? Now, the rest of you must read it within the next 6 months. Not only for its scientific originality, but for its literary quality. It's an exquisitely written book. I think in just terms of its prose, it's superb. So this book by a woman scientist who was actually then dying of cancer about environmental degradation in America, and spring being silent because the robin would not sing because of chemical contamination of the soil and so on and so forth. This book started the American environmental movement, just as Chipko started the Indian environmental movement. So when I went to America and there were these students who were active environmentalists, and I was in my late 20s, they were kind of my age, they acquainted me with the fact that though as a popular movement, organized collective action, American environmentalism started in the 60s after Carson's book. From the 19th century, long before, there had been some visionary American writers who had spoken about the dangers to the American landscape and to wilderness in particular that unregulated industrialization and urbanization posed. And two icons of early American environmentalism, who are regarded as like kind of real pioneers, were John Muir, who founded the Sierra Club and the wilderness movement, and the first national parks in California, who was active in the late 19th century, and Aldo Leopold, who was an ecologist and biologist who worked in the 1920s and 30s. So, in America, there was a prehistory of environmentalism composed of these visionary thinkers and then an actual environmental movement following Rachel Carson's. Now, I thought, so happened while working in these great libraries, university libraries in America, I came across the works of two Indians who were writing in a recognizably, in an idiom that we would today call sustainability, in the 1920s and 30s itself, long before Chipko began. And these two Indians were unknown to me before I discovered them in a library. One was a sociologist called Radha Kamal Mukherjee, who wrote about the importance of common property resources in sustaining agriculture, and also about the need to look at the integration of the natural sciences and the social sciences. And he coined the term social ecology. He said we need to practice a social ecology to harmonize relations between humans and the natural world, and he coined this term in the early 30s. And the other person I discovered was someone called J.C. Kumarappa, who was a follower of Mahatma Gandhi. He had a background in economics, and he spent his life trying to renew the village economy on what we now would call environmental lines. So he talked about the importance of water conservation, maintaining common property resources, the need to abolish untouchability, because it was Dalits and low caste who bore the burden of localized pollution in the village. The importance of forest management, community forest management, and its vital importance both to sustaining nature and to sustaining rural livelihoods. So I discovered, this is almost 40 years ago, these two thinkers who were raising the kinds of questions that Indian environmentalists I knew of in the 70s and 80s were raising. So that took me on a journey which eventually has resulted in this book, Speaking with Nature. The journey has been erratic, interrupted by other projects that have come in the way. But starting with these two thinkers, Kumarappa and Radha Kamal Mukherjee, eventually the book became about 10 people. 10 people who, I argue, were the pioneers of Indian environmentalism, who long before Chipko were warning us about the dangers of unbridled industrialization, about reckless destruction of nature, of the dangers of what human greed would do to the very possibility of human survival. And these 10 thinkers worked in different spheres. Some worked on the village, some worked on the wilderness, some worked in the cities, some worked on were critics of chemical agriculture. There were 10 individuals who feature in this book. 5 were Indians and 5 were foreigners who happened to work in India. So it actually indirectly makes the case that environmentalism is a transnational phenomenon. They were just as Indian ideas, Indian thinkers can influence other parts of the world, we can also learn from what other people with different cultural or religious or national backgrounds have come here and said to us about our problems and our predicaments. So that's what the book is about. It's 9 chapters, but 10 individuals, because one chapter is about a remarkable husband and wife couple called Albert and Gabriel Howard, who were agricultural scientists and pioneers of organic farming globally, but working in India. Most of these people, as I said, I had not heard of. Most of these people are little known today. I myself had not heard of Radha Kamal Mukherjee and J.C. Kumarappa before I began working on them. Some of them are well known, but for other reasons. So I'll just say a little bit about my first chapter, and then I'll kind of end. So my first chapter is about Rabindranath Tagore. Tagore is one of the greatest of modern Indians. We know him as someone who wrote our national anthem. He also wrote the national anthem of Bangladesh, as it turns out. That's also based on a Tagore song. He transformed the Bengali language through his writings, through his plays, his poems, his novels. He was the first Asian to win a Nobel Prize in any discipline. He founded a famous university, Shantiniketan. He inspired many great Indian nationalists personally. He mentored and inspired many great freedom fighters personally, including Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Subhash Chandra Bose. In his 70s, he became a painter and an incredibly innovative and a path-breaking painter. Now, all this is known about Tagore to most people and to me. But I show in my first chapter that apart from all of this, he was also a pioneering environmentalist in the way he wrote about nature, in the way he made environmental education part of the curriculum in Shantiniketan, in the way he critiqued uh, Western imperialism for its destruction of landscapes all across the world. And he was, he was really an early and pioneering environmentalist. So there are a few people in this book, like Tagore, who are known for their contributions in other fields, and I tried to show that actually they were also had some interesting and important things to say about the environmental predicament India faces today. Some of them are less known. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll close, is that these 10 thinkers in my book operated in different domains. So if you come from the domain that is farthest away from human beings, which is the wild, my book ends with a great pioneering nationalist called M. Krishnan, who wrote about the wilderness. But it deals, so the chapters of my book deal with the wild, with the forest, and particularly the interaction between Adivasis and forests, with the village, and the importance of sustainable management of water, pasture, soil, and finally to the city. So, one of the chapters in the book that I particularly enjoyed writing is about a Scottish ecologist called Patrick Geddes, who spent 10 years in India writing about how to make Indian cities more habitable, more responsible in their use of nature and natural resources. So it's a kind of, you could say it's a history of Indian environmentalism before Chipko. It's a history of environmentalism before climate change, but in fact even before Chipko. But I think that apart, it's really a work of scholarship to be read for what it says about the past and these visionary thinkers in the past. But it may have some clues, only a few clues, but nonetheless possibly some insights as to how we, living in the third decade of the 21st century, how the ideas and arguments and proposals of these thinkers may also relate to the way we live in the world today in a time of acute environmental crisis caused, among other things, climate change. I'll end there.
Thank you, Ram. Before I get into questions, I would like to add my own appreciation and admiration for, like I was telling him, it was the first, even if you did not, I would urge you to read all of it, but even if you didn't read the portraits of each of these pioneers featured in the book, I think for everybody, I think the introduction and the epilogue really gives you a very wide span, a historical perspective, as well as a sense of the relevance in the present. And it's written beautifully. I think the whole book is written very beautifully. So it's my pitch for why you must read it. And I think, especially as undergraduates, I definitely would consider giving this as essential reading. So I think it's a very useful perspective. When you're talking of environmentalism, it's also, so to me, what stood out here is that it's a prehistory and intellectual genealogy, as you call it, of environmentalism, but it's very distinct from the American prehistory, which is more about the wilderness and so on. What you have called livelihood environmentalism, which acknowledges that there's a deep interconnectedness between humans and nature in the Indian context, rather than be in a preoccupation of preserving places which are presumed to be pristine. That's not the sense that, yes, with a little bit with how Krishnan sees nature, you may get a sense of wilderness and of wild places, and not so much about people, but nearly everywhere else. It's of nature, which is apart, not rather than apart from humans. And the second very strong impulse that comes in this strand of environmentalism, which Ram has called livelihood environmentalism, is that we are a very deeply stratified society. The needs and interests of various groups are not the same. And, this is also about an environmentalism that is about siding with the vulnerable. I think that is a very, so it's not environmentalism, it's not a history of conservation, for instance. Yeah. It's a history of environmentalism of a very particular kind. And it also is, the way you set it is against the the trope of being too poor to be green, the idea that, you quote Thoreau and Hobsbawm, where does that trope come from? What's the intellectual genealogy of that trope of being too poor to be green?
So it comes from the belief that all societies follow the same trajectory. So you grow, you industrialize, you achieve a certain level of prosperity. Everyone in the society has good schools, good healthcare, dignified livelihood. And once all these other needs have been satisfied, you can think about protecting beautiful landscapes, forests, and saving endangered species. I think I've not studied it, but I think there's a psychologist called Abraham Maslow who also had a hierarchy of needs. And so it comes from that. Now, my argument, I mean, not just in this book, but in stuff I have written earlier, is that pre-modern, pre-industrial societies had to live within the boundaries that nature set. So they understood that the relationship had to be reciprocal and sustainable. And in India, particularly, and in the modern world, it was not as if every society would progress in the same way. That idea that every society had followed a unilinear path did look at the interconnection between societies. The fact that India had been colonized by the British, who had devastated our forests and who had brought in what Patrick Geddes calls carboniferous capitalism here, a capitalism based on fossil fuel. Or the fact that India had much higher population densities, more fragile ecologies than the West. So we were actually in a context like in India, and this was the kind of lesson of Chipko. What the Chipko movement and the writers following the Chipko movement, were arguing was that no, we cannot blindly follow the Western economic development path, which is centralized factories, high energy intensification, where it's a focus on capital, not on labor. We can't follow it because we have suffered already from colonial exploitation. We don't have colonies to conquer. I mean, the white man could go to America, could come to Asia, could go to Africa, could go to Oceania and take over all these places. And also, tropical ecologies are much more fragile. I mean, because of the monsoon, and in the Himalaya, where Chipko started, this is very true because it was really the flood of 1970, which was caused in part by commercial exploitation of Himalayan forests, that gave birth to Chipko, in part. So I think Chipko was saying heavily populated, formerly colonized countries in fragile tropical ecologies have to be, for them, environmentalism is a matter of survival, of livelihood, even of, you could say, of existential issue, right? So I think it was really Chipko that articulated what we may call an environmentalism of the poor. It was not, I mean, and Anil Agarwal, the great pioneering environmental journalist of the 1980s, 70s and 80s, who founded the Center for Science and Environment, said this. He gave a famous lecture, which again I would urge you to Google. It was a lecture given in, I think, the mid-80s, and it's called Beyond Pretty Trees and Tigers. So environmentalism in India is beyond pretty trees and tigers. So it's livelihood environmentalism, not simply about conservation of gorgeous landscapes or protected species. The other thing I'd say, which I think is characteristic of the people in my book, and is linked to the generally at the point you make about stratified India being stratified. I mean, environmentalism in India is generally collective. Historically, in the West, it was one person, usually a man, usually a man going to the wilderness alone, communing with the wilderness, like Henry David Thoreau, the writer, or a butterfly collector, or in some cases even a hunter, So it was really, it was an individual's relationship with nature, whereas in India it's always the community, it's the village, or it's the pastoralist with his flock, or it's the fisherfolk, with the ocean, forest dwelling Adivasi with the forest, So I think that is, and in that sense you get so it's much more, in a sense, there's no separation between humans and nature in the way there often is in Western and particularly American environmentalism.
The trope nevertheless survives in different. It's like clad in different clothes today, but I think the way it still survives is. Here are communities, like you said, pre-modern, pre-industrial, who often they don't have the means to subjugate nature. They don't have they have economic reasons why they stay within their bounds, or technology, various things limit them from the impact they could have on the environment. But the thing also is the distinction that is made is, are you an environmentalist? So is this an epiphenomena? By which what I mean is that their environmental prudence or responsibility or stewardship is merely an outcome of being technologically limited, by being limited by means of that they cannot have larger impacts, that really don't mean to be environmentally so responsible. So rather than, and set in opposition to a view that says environmentalism is that which has environmental well-being as its goal rather than its mere byproduct. So that continues to pervade a large part of our pedagogy in conservation and all of that, even to this day. So that you're also speaking to the relevance of, you're also speaking partly to that, right? In the when you're talking about too poor to be green, the greenness is just would serve just as well, even if it were byproduct or epiphenomenon, as it would if you were if it were the goal. So
Absolutely,
do you have some thoughts on the epiphenomena versus the
No, I think
objective?
also this idea, you're right. I mean, this trope of India is too poor to be green. I mean, also is linked to the desperate desire to catch up with the West. And sometimes this is well-meaning. The West colonized us because they were more powerful technologically, because they had bigger factories, they had more sophisticated armaments, and in a complex international world, we have to hold our own. We have to stand our own. We have to be as big. We have to be as, like, if you're shorter than the classroom bully, you have to go to the gym and develop your muscles so that you can take on the classroom bully. Whatever, who's twice your size. So it comes from that kind of thinking. And some of it is well-meaning. It comes from a sense that we were colonized for these reasons. Now, that may be true, but I think what the climate crisis tells you is that there are limits to the global reproduction of Western standards of production and consumption. And it is true that the West is hypocritical. In the climate change debate shows it very clearly. But at the same time, India cannot, I mean, it's inconceivable that every Indian can have the lifestyle of an average American. That there will be 1 billion plus cars in India is inconceivable. I mean, it's just not within our biophysical means. I mean, forget the moral argument, forget the Gandhian moral argument that one should live simply and so on. So I think these are the questions that these people were raising long ago. I mean, there's a quote from Tagore from 1922 where he talks about, plundering the earth, exhausting the water sources, rifling the soil, and that's exactly what we seem to have done. And I think also from an economic point of view, it makes much greater sense to manage your resources wisely. And I think this is kind of leading away from maybe my book. Yes. But if you look at some economic reasoning, it's only about what the market measures. So if there's a chemical factory that pollutes the river, that doesn't really matter because it's an externality to the factory, and the factory would, is happy to make more profits. So I think GDP measures like GDP, wealth in terms of money don't really capture the environmental damage that all of this is concealing.
So, I mean, to bring it back to something more centrally about the characters in your book, you take great pains to show that the complexity, the nuance and sophistication in their thinking, especially in how they viewed the environment, Indian society, its economics, politics, its ecologies and cultures. You say, I'm quoting a passage, their heterogeneous legacies refute simple-minded dichotomies that posit modernity against tradition, science versus activism, East versus West, and nature versus humanity. And as you say yourself, they've either been forgotten or never recognized for these contributions, these pioneers and the nuance with which they spoke about these complexities. And what this book seeks to do is to resurrect these people and rehabilitate their work and give them the place that they should have in the prehistory of Indian environmentalism. So this suggests that they were marginal in their own times, but they're marginal today as well. And in your other essays and columns you've written, you've commented on how marginal ecological concerns are, how marginal they continue to be in our society and polity. What should we be taking away from this? Is it the fate of environmentalism to remain marginal? Or can it ever hope to be more central to the way we make economic and political choices? What would it entail for environmentalism to become more central? On the other hand, so just let me, on the other hand, there's also this sentiment, if you're looking at the environmentalism of the poor, to the Adivasi or Dalit, it appears that environmentalism, or at least certain flavors of it, have too much power. Yeah. That too is an apparent paradox. So could you resolve?
I mean, the second part is slightly more complicated. I would say that to the Adivasi, it is the conservationist who has too much power, not the environmentalist. I mean, you said early on that my book is not about conservation, but correct, broadly about environmentalism. So on the first part, I'll have to give a little bit of economic history here, if I may, for a few minutes. So Chipko started in the 70s. Chipko and Narmada and movements like that were arguing that India needed to adopt a more inclusive and more environmentally responsible path of development. And then in 1991 you had economic liberalization. The economy was run tightly controlled by the state. You had what was called the license permit quota Raj, which was inefficient from a purely economic point of view. So there was economic liberalization, and the system of controls and permits was dismantled. And by dismantling it, you led to a surge of economic growth and innovation. So there were some very good things about liberalization. But liberalization led to an even greater devastation of the environment because there were no checks. The one place where you needed more checks and more controls was, the air, the water, the forests, the soils, and so on. And because economic liberalization was regarded as necessary for the economy, it was widely and enthusiastically supported in the press. And there was a kind of a talk, to use your term, the trope. The trope was, if only India was kept backwards because it had not liberalized. If India, now that liberalization had come, remove all checks and balances, and India will become Singapore writ large. We'll become 1 billion happy consumers. And the only people raising questions were environmentalists. Why are you citing this chemical factory here? It is polluting the Tungabhadra river. Why are you opening a mine in an Adivasi area? The Adivasis are being dispossessed and the fields are being destroyed. And so the idea was the environmentalists are keeping India backwards. And they are funded by foreign agents. Now that was the kind of enormous, whereas actually the environmentalists thought they were speaking both for the poor and for the future, for generations, the vulnerable today and for generations unborn. Because you have to, we have to bequeath a decent enough earth for them. Now, I think that there's a radical so there was an anti-environmental movement. So Chipko started the environmental movement, which ran through the 70s and 80s. In the 90s and 2000s, there was an anti-environmental movement. And in fact, in an earlier book, I've talked about how newspaper columnists used to attack Medha Patkar every summer and every winter. So they're sitting in their, in summer, they're sitting in the air-conditioned cabin in Delhi, and the power goes off and they start sweating and they say, it's Medha Patkar, she has stopped the supply of power to Delhi. And in winter, they're feeling very cold and the heater suddenly stops going. And I'm not kidding, I actually documented the attacks on Medha Patkar by one New Delhi columnist, and they were usually in May and usually in December. Now, so that's what happened. And Medha Patkar is just an example, all of us have faced this. However, I'd say two things. One, young people today, not just in this room, but my children or my children's classmates are much more environmentally conscious than I ever was. And that's probably even true for Harini and you, even though you're a little somewhat younger than me, right? That in our generation, it was all about growth, development, catching up with the West, becoming more powerful, becoming more strong. And there was no concern for, and I think things have happened. I think climate change crisis also has made us more aware of this. So I think now, in a sense, these environmentalists whose ideas were marginal then, and it could be that young people will see something in what they say to resonate with how they understand the world. And these are young people who it's quite, I don't know whether it has come to how much it is visible in our country. But if you travel in the more affluent countries of the world, Many young couples don't want to have children because of climate change. I mean, they have a sense of impending doom and apocalypse, right? Now, maybe Indians don't have it, and they shouldn't be. They shouldn't be unduly pessimistic. But clearly, if you see, if you see, if you see, forget about climate change. So let's not look at climate change for. Let's assume there was no climate change. India would still have the cities of northern India would still have the highest rates of air pollution in the world. If there was no climate change, our rivers would still be biologically dead. I mean, the Ganga outside Banaras and the Jamuna outside Delhi and the Narmada in Indore would all be dead, right? Look, the groundwater, even if there was no climate change, the aquifers in the Punjab will be depleting. Bangalore will be reaching, for going farther and farther away for its water. And so we are facing massive, multifaceted environmental abuse which affects the livelihoods of ordinary Indians on a daily basis. And climate change makes it worse, because because of climate change, if there is, say in the Himalaya, if there is soil erosion and careless road building and there's a flash flood, the human destruction will be worse. So I think young people are seeing this. I mean, I think now there is enough. I don't think the politicians are not seeing it. The large industries are not seeing it. The mining companies are not seeing it. The newspaper owners are not seeing it because they have got other and more ephemeral preoccupations. But young people, I think, are understanding this. So I think that is one source of hope. The second source of hope, and I was talking before our conversation with Harini about this, is that now there is a very large reservoir of scientific knowledge and expertise in environmental fields. I mean, compared to 30 years ago, India has more and better trained ecologists, more and better trained scientists, more and better trained hydrologists, more and better trained energy scientists, people who can talk about sustainable transport, housing. Now, how to get the idealism and alertness and knowledge of the young on the one hand, and the scientific expertise of people like Madhusudan and Harini Nagendra on the other, into policy and real change. That's a separate question. Maybe that will not happen, but at least this side of the equation is there, which was not there 40 years ago. The young thought all environmentalists are CIA agents, because that's what the media had told them, right? And we didn't have the kind of high quality scientists you have in our universities who can actually help us move towards a more sustainable and a more inclusive and a more, caring path of economic progress. So that's, and I think one of the things about this book is it's a work of scholarship. It's not, thank you for your compliments about how well it is written, but it's still 400 pages long. It's not, a tweet or a WhatsApp forward or a Instagram post. But I'm hoping that it will be read also because I've tried to get it translated into some languages too. So it's certainly coming in Telugu and in Malayalam and in Bengali and Hindi. So 4 languages I have arranged for translations and hopefully some more. Because I think this is, so maybe, it's like, I think, and often pioneers are discovered much later. I'll give you an example. Okay. Everyone here knows about Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. I will not ask you to raise hands because that would be unfair. But I suspect that everyone here knows about Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and his extraordinary contributions to scholarship and to social reform and to our constitution, which celebrates its 75th anniversary in about a week's time, right? But my guess is that in this audience, my guess is, and I don't want to test it, that will not be fair to individuals, my guess is less than 50% know about Jyotiba and Savitri Phule. It may be 30% may know. But 50 years ago, 0.3% would have known. Right. So the Jyotiba and Savitri Phule were visionary reformers of Maharashtra in the 19th century, promoting both the emancipation of low caste and women's education. Now, and in parts of Maharashtra, everyone know about them. Right. Now, so sometimes this happens that pioneers are discovered late. Visionaries are discovered late. I mean, even when I talked about America, I mean, Aldo Leopold had been forgotten, and it was like after Rachel Carson's that you discovered his work. So I think hopefully some of what are the ideas of these people will come back into circulation. One last thing I'd say, I'd like to underline, this is a work of historical scholarship. It's not a work of advocacy. It's not a work of policy. But it's a work of curiosity about these fascinating, interesting people who wrote so perceptively and presently about environmental issues. But somewhere here and there may be clues. You can't take Tagore's ideas and apply them to how environmental education should be practiced in Azim Premji University. You can't take Patrick Geddes' ideas and say this is Patrick Geddes, who wrote in the 1920s, will tell us how to make Bangalore a better place in the 2020s. No, no. But I think some ideas, some philosophical orientations, some sense of some anchoring, I think may be available for younger people today.
So the concern about environmentalism still being there is a more aware youth, there is greater expertise
Yeah.
on tap, but there is still some friction, there is some reluctance for it's not as if it's diffusing into decision making context, and there are larger systems that this kind of that are disadvantaged by this. So are these, do you see, I mean, it was a very different time when India was still a colony, and it's a very different time now. But do you see a certain commonality of interests that push back against
So
and keep environmentalism
Not
marginal?
for colony from when in the 50s and 60s and even 70s till today. There is a commonality. And again, I'm not. I'm a scholar, not really. Don't understand policy that much. But my sense is, I'll give a concrete example. Having said that, I think what is really important for wise environmental policy and social policy is the free flow of ideas, transparency in information, and decentralization in decision making. If everything is centralized, what we have, the 73rd and 74th amendments, which empower panchayats and municipalities, have no teeth. That is, you elect your mayor, but the mayor has no powers, financial or otherwise. The powers are in Vidhan Sabha. And increasingly over the last decade, the powers of Vidhan Sabha are going to Delhi. I mean, we are even removing the powers of the states. We are seeing it in many, many, many respects. I think decentralization leads to better and more responsible environmental management and more probably fairer social outcomes as well. I mean, community forestry, the Forest Rights Act would be an example. And probably even in urban planning, those could be ways. So it would have to be eventually the fight for I wouldn't say fight, the campaign, because fight is too militant for my taste, and I'm a biographer of Gandhi, so I don't want to advocate armed revolution. So the campaign for a more inclusive society and a more sustainable future has to somewhere take a political turn, which does not mean forming a political party, but for more transparency, more accountability, and a greater decentralization of decision making. I think, my book ends, as you will recall in the epilogue, Madhu, with a visit to Gadchiroli.
Yes.
And seeing, Adivasi villages who had been granted the bamboo forest back under the Forest Rights Act, and how that led to a renewal of their ecology, their culture, their society, their economy. And now I'm told the Maharashtra government wants to build a steel plant in Gadchiroli, which will only help a few industrialists in Bombay, because the Adivasis are not likely to get jobs there too, because they don't have those, so-called modern technical skills. So I think that it may, but I think my sense is that in terms of just consciousness, we are in a better place than we were 50 years ago or 40 years ago when I started out as a scholar.
Okay, so you hope
Not in terms of who controls political power, who makes decisions, but the awareness that that environmentalism is not simply a Western fad, that it matters to all of us, that environmentalism is not simply about protecting endangered species, it's about building a more caring, a more just, a more humane society. I think that understanding, more subtle, sophisticated, true understanding, is more widespread than it was 30 or 40 years ago.
I'll hold myself back from asking how much this enlightened view of the young and growing Indian, the population of growing population.
It may still be a minority among the young.
Huh?
It may still be a minority among the young.
Yeah.
Young men in particular may be doing other and more stupid things with their smartphones. I would say that I can accept that, because it may still be a minority. But for 30 or 40 years ago, it was invisible and absent.
Right.
So now at least it may be a significant minority of 10, 15, 20, 30%.
Yeah.
Is what I'm saying.
Okay, it's becoming less marginal,
Yeah,
but I think
less,
in
yeah,
the,
yeah. It has to be overall marginal, but less marginal.
okay. So I want to kind of change tracks to how you kind of frame the book. You show how each of the thinkers and the pioneers in your book posited the idea of livelihood environmentalism in contrast to full stomach environmentalism, as you called it, of the affluent world, while challenging this idea that you are too poor to be green. You also say that the early work on environmentalism sought to challenge the idea that poorer countries of the global south, especially the poorer individuals within it, would not be interested in treating nature or natural resources with care, understanding, and respect. Without doubt, this is a view that has definitely enriched our understanding of environmentalism, especially of its subaltern in a global frame, in the sense that this really has been the less understood, less visible and visibilized part of environmentalism. But if we were to narrow the frame somewhat from one that put these environmental thinkers alongside the intellectual peers from the West, to one that's entirely within the Indian context, nearly all the individuals you profile come from significant privilege, some of race, other of caste, class, or wealth.
Right, right.
In a sense, they would represent this full stomach environmentalists. If you narrowed the frame, of course, you show their empathy with the weak, their solidarity with the vulnerable, and how they use their privilege not to serve power but to challenge it, and as conscience keepers. Nevertheless, while their positions were sympathetic to livelihood environmentalism, they represented the same structures that marginalized the grassroots environmentalist. The one of the poorer, the one with the less full belly. This has not changed greatly even today. So it's easier to find voices from privilege being sympathetic to grassroots environmental sensibilities and struggles, but it's still rare for us to see people from those marginalized communities and on-ground movements that gain the pride of place they deserve. So perhaps it was something, like this. I remember seeing an essay in the mid-90s where Gail Ombet wrote about why, Dalits dislike environmentalists. So, is this a view you would agree with? If what would it take to actually attempt an intellectual genealogy of livelihood environmentalism, where it's not. So, what I'm trying to say is, if we reframed and saw these people as the full belly environmentalists, and there is still a subaltern, the material is very different. You don't have a rich historical record. It's mostly oral. There's no archival record, and it's virtually non-existent. So what might it take to reimagine in a fractal dimension framed narrowly within India an alternate livelihood environmentalism from the grassroots?
So I'd say I have two answers to that. One is, if you look at the kind of 19th and early 20th century, some of it would be in practices of Adivasi and peasant communities. How they're related to water, forests, biodiversity, medicinal plants, and so on. Of course, the caste issue would be there very much. I think in the characters I profiled, some understand it. I think Kumarappa and Mirabai understand the caste dimension, and one or two don't, right? And I think the work of Mukul Sharma, who's been writing on caste issues today, and if you look at the struggle of the 70s and 80s, Chipko was not intellectuals; it was subaltern environmentalism. And Narmada maybe is a combination. The leadership is elite. Mera not elite, but middle class from urban. Mera Patkar and her closest associates were from cities. But one of the more interesting, really interesting, less visible and less studied livelihood environmental struggles of the that early phase, 70s and 80s, is the Kerala fisher folk struggle, which is artisanal fisher folk against large trawlers. And the artisanal fisher folk are representing the community, but also more sustainable means of fishing than the large trawlers who are, trawling through the seabed and not respecting the spawning species and so on. So I think but the other thing I'd say is that what climate change does is actually makes us all makes bedfellows of all of us. If a cyclone, if there's a flash flood in the Wayanad, the Adivasi and the tea planter in his bungalow may suffer equally, right? So I think that's where some bridges have to be built without, ignoring the the polarities of caste and class and gender. I think how to build these alliances. I mean, D.R. Nagaraj, the late D.R. Nagaraj, who was a legendary Kannada thinker who died young, used to always say, who was actually a scholar of the Dalit movement, but was not hostile to the environmental movement. He said questions about sustainability, relating to nature, bequeathing a fair world to our descendants should matter to Dalits too. So I don't know how. I mean, I have not thought through it very carefully, and I personally, I myself am more in the mold of people like Meera and Kumarappa. In that though I intellectually recognize the issues of caste and gender discrimination. I mean, I'm an upper caste man by birth and upbringing. But though I don't take it for granted, I don't salute it, I don't celebrate it. But that still, in a sense, it is a problem. It's true that, but I think the awareness is the first issue. I mean, when Gandhi was jailed for the first time, in those days you had to give your caste, and he was a badhya, he was a middle. He said, farmer and weaver is what he said. Because actually it was true. He was a weaver, right? Now, I think the awareness among the privileged is not should not be simply seen as tokenism. I think there's also a place. I think even today, I mean, for example, this university is a good example. This university is an example of a self-aware billionaire who has donated a large portion of his wealth to set up this university. So there is a difference between Azim, Premji and other industrialists whom I will not name, right? Who may be richer than him and who have more money to spend than him, right? So that's it. So the people in this book are, you could see them as that's the Azim Premjis of early Indian environmentalism. Themselves not livelihood environmentalists, but aware of the significance of livelihood environmentalism.
And what might it take? I mean, this is not fair to you because it's not really about your book, but as a person who's been curious about this kind of thing, has thought about this, what might it entail to write an environment, a kind of a prehistory of grassroots environmentalism, so the material is very, very different.
I mean, I think anthropology, folklore studies, archaeological stuff, all these. There's also other things that my book does not do. For example, it only deals with non-fiction. So it's an account based on essays, scientific treatises, plans, journalistic writings. But if you look at, for example, I don't read Kannada, but you read Kannada. But I'm told Kuvempu and his son Purnachandra Tejasvi are kind of environmental thinkers in their fiction, but it's not in their polemics or their essays. It's in their poems and their stories. Shweta Devi or Sugata Kumari in Malayalam. So I think let's say the early history of environmentalism can be written from different dimensions. Mine is a work focused on writers, intellectuals, and scientists. Correct. There could be another work looking at novelists, poets, playwrights. There could be a third kind of work looking at everyday livelihood practices of subaltern communities. So I think it's a rich field, and hopefully lots of.
It's a conversation that's begun.
Yeah.
I mean, when I think of the people in this room, there's something I want to change tracks. I want to ask about something that's a bit more personal. You've said on multiple occasions that you studied economics and sociology, not history. Yet the world knows you as a historian. Your works cover political history, environmental history, intellectual history, and biography. Would you like to share your reflections on how one goes from being an interloper in a discipline and domain, history in your case, to becoming someone respected and distinguished for their contributions in that very field? I mean, I think I also asked this partly out of, thinking of myself, having to commit to a certain domain, having to commit to a certain thing is always you feel as if you cut yourself out of many other ways in which you could contribute or even explore. And this is a very big change, and you've distinguished yourself in a field that you are not formally trained in. And I think that would be of great interest and relevance to this.
The first thing I'd say is there are quite a few examples of that. So in India too, I mean, the most influential historian of ancient India was someone called D.D. Kosambi, who studied mathematics. I am a historian of modern India. Okay, someone who was In his time, the leading historian of ancient India, D.D. Kosambi, was a mathematician. Sanjay Subramanian, who is probably the most celebrated historian of medieval and early modern India, has MA, BA, MA, and a PhD in economics. Right. I'm a sociologist. If you look at biology, one of the greatest biologists of the 20th century. Today, if you look at biologists today, so I moved from sociology to history, which are it's a kind of adjacent field. Okay, it's adjacent field. I did take a degree in history, but if you look at the biologists today, some of the top Indian biologists were either physicists or engineers who turned to biology. If you look at one of the greatest biologists of the 20th century, J.B.S. Haldane studied Latin and Greek at Oxford. He had no degree in biology. Right. So sometimes he came to biology later and so on and so forth. So I think sometimes coming from a different discipline can give you a more original, more less conventional, stereotyped perspective. But you have to learn the tools. So you have to learn as a if you want to become a historian, you have to do original research. In my case, you have to look for old documents, manuscripts, spend decades in the archives looking for fugitive stuff to stitch together a narrative, to learn how to interpret it. And only then people will start recognizing you as something who's not an interloper, right? But people may still say so. I mean, it's peculiar, but but there are examples like that, and I think it's in my case, sociology and history are not. It's more like a physicist becoming a biologist. D.D. Kosambi, who's a mathematician, will become a historian, and J.B.S. Haldane, who was a classical scholar, will become a biologist. And they were much more daring, much more. But their achievement is much, much greater. I mean, much more striking. Because sociology is like, I mean, I'm sure moving from physics to biology is quite very much the case now, right? I mean, like, so.
I want to ask one question, which is, this is, I mean, as any book, this one will also be read differently by different people. But this audience has people from history, biology, environment science, possibly economics, and so on. And your book is really at the confluence of many of these disciplinary streams.
So I think there is very little. I mean, there's some there's some development policy in it, not like proper economics.
So my question was, if you have a suggestion on how differently it should or could be read by people from these different perspectives,
so
what would your...
every reader makes their own judgment of a book. I mean, I was telling Harini before that this book has 9 chapters and 10 individuals. And the readers so far I have met have, some have said the chapter, I knew a lot about, Patrick Geddes because I'm an architect and I knew about his work on cities, but the chapter on J.C. Kumarappa and village life was really interesting. Or somebody says, I know about Tagore's poetry, but I didn't know about his environmental work. So it does depend. So I think different people react differently. I think they're all, 10 quite extraordinary individuals who left behind a volume of writing that I was able to analyze. I mean, there are people I didn't include, which we've not talked about. For example, Salim Ali, I'm not included, who could have been a possibility. And people will say, why no chapter on Salim Ali and so on. So I think when a book goes out in the world, you have no control over how it's received, and you just do the best you can. And at some stage you decide that I can do no better, because I mean, the thing is, every work of history, you use the term conversation. It takes its clues from a previous conversation and it hopes to contribute to a future conversation. So it's part of that. And yeah, I mean, I found actually that personally, I found the chapter. This book was read in draft. I should say this. 4 or 5 environmental scholars really helped me make it a better book, and they were all non-Indians because I wanted, because this got a comparative perspective. But I did not show the whole book to any Indian, but I showed individual chapters to 2 Indians. So the chapter that was most difficult for me to write was in the Howards, who are agricultural scientists. Because I do not come from a farming background, I've studied forests as a scholar, I live in cities, I know the wild, but farming per se, agriculture, I wanted feedback from a real scholar, and A.R. Vasavi, who's a leading agrarian sociologist who most of you know, kindly read the chapter on Harvard for me. And I wanted the chapter Tagore to be read by a Bengali scholar because I was worried about what the Bengalis would say, that this guy sitting in Bangalore doesn't read Bengali, is writing on Tagore. So there's a professor, Shantiniketan, called Swati Ganguly, who's a great scholar of, who wrote a very good book on Shantiniketan, scholar of Tagore. So she showed it. So I was nervous about those two chapters. One, because I'm writing about a Bengali icon. You know, it would be like as someone who was, although I greatly admire B.R. Ambedkar, the fact that I'm born in a Brahmin household means I'd be diffident about writing about B.R. Ambedkar. And similarly with Tagore, it's almost as daunting, you know, like, so those are two chapters I was nervous about, Tagore and the Howards, for these reasons. Yeah.
I hope you'll all join me in thanking them very much for a very, very interesting and I think